London exhaled its evening fog and pale, twisting tendrils that wound through the narrow lanes like skeletal fingers. In the heart of Whitechapel, where gaslights flickered like dying eyes, Detective Alaric Thorne emerged from his shadowed lodgings, the weight of unshed guilt pressing against his chest. His mind, a labyrinth of memories and regrets, had long since abandoned any illusions of peace. Tonight, however, a summons hand delivered in heavy, perfumed paper had stirred the embers of curiosity, a dangerous flame for a man whose life had become a procession of grim certainties. The envelope bore the crest of the Botanical Society, its wax seal imprinted with a spiraling helix of leaves and thorns. Thorne's gloved fingers hesitated over the paper. Opening it revealed a succinct invitation to an evening gathering at the Society's greenhouse on the outskirts of Bloomsbury. Crossing the cobblestones, Thorne passed by shuttered windows and the occasional hollow-eyed vagrant. The air bore the tang of wet earth and coal smoke, a mixture he had learned to inhale as a prelude to violence. At the edge of the city, the greenhouse rose like a cathedral of glass and iron, dripping with condensation, its interior lights flickering, as though attempting to breathe against the thick night. Inside, the air was warm and damp, heavy with the scent of soil, decay, and the faint, intoxicating perfume of exotic blooms. Figures moved in the shadows, clad in formal black, murmuring among rare orchids and pitcher plants. Thorne's gaze, however, was drawn to a single object in the center of the room, a blackened, twisted specimen of what appeared to be a mandrake, its gnarled roots almost human in their contorted agony. Before he could examine it, a soft, deliberate voice whispered behind him, "Detective Thorne, you are observant, though not yet wise. The mandrake is but a prelude." He turned to see Dr. Lysandra Vey, the Society's lead botanist, her eyes sharp, almost predatory, and her smile like a knife pressed against the delicate skin of his curiosity. She gestured to a velvet-covered table, upon which rested a small sealed vial. Within the vial was a liquid blacker than midnight, its surface seeming to pulse with a life of its own. "It begins with a touch," she said, "the first of several lessons, and all are bound in the same dark root. You may consider it a challenge or a warning." Thorne's pulse quickened. The room's shadows deepened, and the faint glimmer of gaslight caught the edges of a page pinned beside the mandrake. A botanical sketch, drawn in exquisite detail, depicted a flower that did not exist in any known catalogue. Beneath it, in precise looping script, were the words, "Death blooms quietly, but always leaves a signature." A chill crept along Thorne's spine. Somewhere in the depths of the greenhouse, a faint rustle echoed a sound too deliberate to be natural. Detective Alaric Thorne stood over the fallen figure, the faint lamplight catching in the victim's wide, terrified eyes. The greenhouse smelled of damp soil and decay, but now a sharper scent mingled a metallic tang that crawled beneath his skin. The black petal in the corpse's hand seemed almost to pulse, as if holding some unspoken message within its fragile structure. He knelt, examining it with the precision of a man who had spent his life reading the language of death and nature alike. The petal was glossy, almost oily, its edges curling with unnatural symmetry. He recognized a botanical pattern, immediately not from books, but from nightmares that had stalked him since his early investigations. Viridia nocturna, a plant whispered about in obscure horticultural journals, known only as a myth and feared for its poison. a single touch could induce hallucinations so vivid they destroyed the mind before the body succumbed. Yet the thing lying before him was real, tangible, and black as morning. Whoever had chosen this method of murder had studied it, embraced it, and imbued it with artistry. Thorne's mind, ever a knife slicing through the mists of chaos, began assembling fragments. The mandrake, the vial of black liquid, the meticulous sketch. They were not random. They were a series of messages, a cryptic trail leading somewhere dark. A faint sound footsteps against wet stone brought Thorne back to the present. He turned sharply, seeing Dr. Lysandre approach, her expression a mask of composure that barely concealed a glint of triumph. "He touched the wrong root," she murmured, voice almost theatrical in its calmness. "Curiosity is expensive." Thorne did not answer immediately. Instead, he held the petal under the dim light, noticing the veins that ran like a miniature topography, ending in a minute, almost imperceptible symbol etched along the base, a spiral entwined with a dagger. His pulse quickened. Whoever left this had a signature, a style of violence and intellect. This was not murder for gain or anger. It was a statement. He rose, keeping his gaze on Dr. V, who seemed entirely unconcerned by the corpse sprawled at her feet. "And what lesson does this teach?" he asked, voice low, threaded with warning. "Observation," she replied simply. "Every plant has a secret, detective, and every secret requires its price." Her eyes glimmered with something colder than the night. Thorne awoke to a city drowned in drizzle, the kind that makes the gaslight smear like molten gold across the slick cobblestones. The black petal rested on the table beside his ink-stained notes, its surface still glimmering with an unholy vitality. He had not slept. Sleep had become a distant memory, displaced by visions of the mandrake, the black vial, and the corpse's pleading eyes. The spiral dagger mark haunted him, a cipher that refused to yield its meaning. By mid-morning, he was on the trail. The Botanical Society's greenhouse had offered only fragments, and in London's underbelly, such fragments were swallowed by fog and filth before they could become evidence. Thorne moved deliberately, his coat collar drawn high, every step measured against the pulse of the city. Somewhere in the whispers of wet streets and the hiss of horses, he sensed the hidden hand guiding him, shaping him as much as he sought to shape the truth. His first stop was the Society's library, a cavernous, shadowed room of leather-bound tomes and brittle botanical sketches. Dust floated like faint specters in the shafts of daylight. Thorne's gloved fingers traced the spines, pausing on a slim volume with no title on its cover. Inside, illustrations of exotic plants filled the pages, annotated in a meticulous, almost obsessive hand. One sketch mirrored the black petal almost exactly, a small, nocturnal flower with curling black petals and a faintly luminescent stamen. Beneath it, a note in looping script read, "One bloom bears the secret. One bloom bears the soul." A shiver ran down Thorne's spine. The phrase was more than poetic. It was a warning. Whoever orchestrated this sequence of murders treated each death as a deliberate flourish, as though human life were yet another specimen to be catalogued, examined, and ultimately consumed by their art. As he turned to leave, A low sound caught his attention, a faint whisper from the corner of the library. He froze, listening. The whisper rose again, indecipherable but deliberate, like a voice brushing against his subconscious. Thorn moved silently toward the sound. His heart hammered in his chest, and the hairs on his neck stood in rigid attention. The fog of London clung to Detective Thorne like a shroud, curling through alleyways and between the skeletal frameworks of abandoned warehouses. He moved with a deliberate caution born of nights, haunted by black petals and severed hands, his senses sharpened to the faintest disturbance. Each shadow seemed to quiver with intent, each breath of wind a whisper from an unseen observer. He had spent the day tracing the origin of the pollen discovered in the library. Every sample, every botanical record led him deeper into a labyrinth of greenhouses, clandestine gardens, and private collections hidden in the city's forgotten quarters. Each location was connected by a chain of silent compacts and whispered introductions, a network of horticultural obsession that seemed innocent on the surface, but beneath it thrummed with something darker. Thorne began to suspect that the killer was not a lone artist of death, but the orchestrator of a secret society devoted to the mastery of poisonous plants. At a hidden courtyard off Fleet Street, he met Professor Alistair Crane, a retired botanist whose reputation for eccentricity masked a mind as precise as any surgeon's. Crane's study was a chaotic jungle of creeping vines and glass jars, each containing carefully labeled specimens. Thorne observed the room with a detective's precision, noting the subtle symbols etched into the frames of botanical prints, the same spiral dagger motif from the black petal. "Detective Thorne," Crane said, his voice a dry rustle like leaves on stone. "I feared it was only a matter of time before the botanist's game drew you in. You have the eyes, at least, though perhaps too eager to see." "Too eager?" Thorne asked, glancing at a jar containing a plant whose roots seemed to writhe like serpents. "I am not here for idle curiosity. Someone is killing, leaving botanical signatures like calling cards. I intend to stop them." Crane's eyes gleamed. But you misunderstand. They are not leaving signatures for you. They are leaving instructions, and to follow them is to walk willingly into a snare." Thorne frowned. The puzzle was tightening, the strings of the killer's design weaving a cage around him. Crane motioned toward a wall covered in pressed flowers and notes, black petals, crimson buds, and brittle leaves all meticulously annotated. Among them, a single drawing of a plant Thorne had never seen before, a creeping vine, its tendrils tipped with glassy thorns, entwined around a human skeleton. Beneath it, in the same looping script, "Some lessons demand sacrifice. Some must be witnessed." Rain fell in relentless sheets over London, turning streets to silvered rivers under the flickering gaslight. Detective Thorne felt it drumming against the city's rooftops like a prelude, a warning that nature itself was complicit in the botanist designs. The note from the previous night, "The garden awaits," Detective burned in his mind, a summons he could not ignore. Following the trail of subtle pollen residues and the faint scent of black violets, Thorne arrived at the edge of a derelict walled estate in the district of Clerkenwell. The gates were wrought iron, twisted into patterns of thorns and spirals that seemed to mirror the spiral dagger motif of the black petal. Beyond them, shadows pooled like ink, and the scent of moist earth and decay was almost intoxicating. He crossed the threshold cautiously, boots sinking into the soft mud of an overgrown path. The garden beyond was no ordinary estate plot. It had been allowed to mutate into a wild, controlled chaos. Clusters of exotic and poisonous flora were arranged with deliberate artistry. Some flowers glimmered in hues unnatural to the eye, others exuded scents that made the mind dizzy, pulling at memory and desire. Ahead, the faint flicker of gaslight revealed a greenhouse, its glass cracked and warped. Thorne's instincts told him this was a trap, yet the pull of curiosity, sharpened by obsession, was irresistible. He approached, the crunch of wet leaves underfoot sounding louder than it should, echoing in the suffocating stillness. Inside the greenhouse was an apothecary of death. Vines curled around iron supports like serpents, and hanging ferns dripped a liquid so dark it seemed almost viscous. At the center, a platform of stone held a small garden bed, and upon it rested a familiar black, petal the same as the first glimmering and alive. But surrounding it were dozens of other plants, each more exotic and poisonous than the last. A voice, soft and deliberate, slid through the damp air. "Detective Thorne, welcome to the first true lesson." Dr. Lysandra Vey stepped from the shadows, her coat brushing against the leaves without disturbing them, her eyes glittering like dark jewels. "You have observed, analyzed, and deduced. Now you must choose. To reach the next clue, to survive, you must navigate the passage of thorns. Before him, a corridor of interlacing vines and razor-edged leaves extended into darkness. The plants reacted to his presence, curling and twisting, creating a living maze designed to punish hesitation and reward precision. The scent of the black petal intensified, its intoxicating aroma threatening to cloud his mind. Thorne's hand hovered above the nearest vine, feeling the slight tremor of life beneath his fingers. Each step was a negotiation with death itself. A wrong touch, a slight miscalculation, and the plants would release poisons, some fast-acting, others insidious, capable of hallucinations, paralysis, or worse. Detective Thorne lingered in the dim chamber, the candle's flame trembling against the thick glass of the vial that held the black petal. He turned the small object in his fingers, examining the spiraled dagger mark again. It was precise, almost surgical, an artist's signature etched into a living work of death. And yet, as he studied it, a subtle pattern emerged, a code, a rhythm, a language written not in words, but in veins, curves, and sharp angles. He spread the new letter atop his scattered sketches. The looping script carried a chilling elegance. Observe what flourishes in shadow, and understand that life and death are but two faces of the same leaf. The next bloom waits for those who see beyond fear. The message was at once invitation and threat, teasing the detective to decode a botanical riddle. Thorne set himself to the task with the meticulous patience of a man both haunted and obsessed. The spiral dagger, he realized, was more than a signature. It was directional. Following the curves with his mind, He traced a path across the petals, imagining their growth as a map. The veins, the slight asymmetry, even the faint pollen residue suggested a pattern. Hours passed, the night outside pressing against the thin walls of his lodgings. Thorne's fingers were stained with ink and soil as he reconstructed the petal and sketches, mapping it alongside the previous clue, the severed hand in the library and the creeping vine in Crane's collection. A slow, terrible clarity settled over him. The botanist was creating a chain of death, each murder a node connected by a living map of plants, each signature a breadcrumb of intention. A sudden knock at the window startled him. The street below was empty, and yet he noticed a faint green shimmer in the fog, reflection of phosphorescent leaves, impossibly bright in the gloom. He leaned closer, peering through the glass. The shimmer vanished. Only then did he notice the small folded note that had appeared on the sill. No footprints, no disturbances, just the pale paper, as though delivered by some unseen hand. The note read simply, "The blossom of truth cannot bloom in light. Seek where the soil is richest with shadow." Thorne's pulse quickened. The Botanical Society's archives were rich in historical records, but this implied a more secret collection, an underground garden, perhaps hidden beneath London itself. And if the botanist was guiding him there, it was no longer a matter of chance. He was being invited into the killer's inner sanctum, step by calculated step. He pored over maps of the city, cross-referencing the spread of exotic plant collections, forgotten courtyards, and subterranean cellars. One location stood out, an abandoned greenhouse beneath the ruins of an old apothecary near the Thames, overgrown with creeping ivies and vines that had long been whispered about in horticultural circles for harboring rare and lethal species. The entrance to the abandoned apothecary loomed like a maw in the Thames-side mist, its boarded windows black voids staring down at Detective Thorne. He pushed aside the rotting boards, the smell of mold and wet earth immediately filling his nostrils. The faint echo of dripping water from below sounded like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, marking time for some unseen observer. Thorne descended the narrow stone stairs, each step coated in grime that crumbled under his boots. The air grew warmer, thick with the perfume of rotting leaves and the sharp tang of chemicals long abandoned. The city above was gone, replaced by an oppressive subterranean forest. Vines hung from the ceiling like pendulums, dripping with black sap that shimmered faintly under his lamp. He had entered the botanist's inner sanctum, a hidden labyrinth designed with a perverse artistry. At the center of the greenhouse, a single pedestal held a black petal identical to the previous ones, but this time it was surrounded by mirrors. Each reflection multiplied the petals infinitely, creating the illusion of countless blooms suspended in darkness. Thorne approached cautiously, every sense alert. The fragrance was heavier here, almost intoxicating, and for a moment his thoughts clouded with faint, hallucinatory images, faces of victims, the gnarled mandrake, and the black-drenched leaves curling toward him. A soft, melodic voice broke the silence. "You have come far, detective. Few reach this chamber." Dr. Lysandra Vey stepped from the shadows, her eyes glinting in the reflection of the mirrors. She moved with the grace of a predator, silent and deliberate. But distance alone does not grant understanding. Here you will learn the first truth of the garden. Thorne's hand hovered over the black petal. The mirrors made the room seem infinite, and he felt a creeping vertigo. He noticed for the first time that the reflections did not perfectly mimic his movements. Some petals seemed to twitch independently. Some shadows moved contrary to his own. The room was designed not merely to conceal, but to disorient, to make perception a treacherous landscape. "The garden teaches," Vey said softly, circling him. "Death is not merely an end. It is the cultivation of understanding. Each bloom, each poison, each touch of the soil, these are lessons written in life and death alike. To survive, you must read them." Thorn's mind, trained to observe, began piecing together subtle clues. The angles of light, the faint indentation of footprints, and the slight discoloration of the petals in the reflections. They indicated a path, a rhythm of movement through the mirrors. One wrong step, and he realized, might trigger the toxic microdroplets hidden in the blooms. Poison suspended in vapor designed to cloud the senses would transform his pursuit into delirium, perhaps permanent. The fog over London had deepened, thickening into a suffocating blanket that swallowed the gaslight glow and muffled the clatter of carriage wheels. Detective Thorne returned to his lodgings, black petal in hand, the lingering scent of the underground greenhouse clinging to his coat. He spread his notes across the table, sketches overlapping sketches, tracing connections between each clue, each deadly bloom. His obsession gnawed at him. Each petal, each note, seemed to resonate with his own fractured thoughts, pulling him further into the botanist's labyrinthine mind. A sharp rap at the door made him start. Standing there was a messenger soaked to the bone, clutching a letter sealed with the spiral dagger motif. No words were spoken. The man retreated into the fog as silently as he had appeared. Thorne broke the seal, his pulse accelerating. The letter contained only a single chilling message. The first witness blooms in crimson. Seek the heart where death and desire meet. And remember, the gardener watches your choices as carefully as his plants. Thorne's brow furrowed. Crimson, he muttered, thinking through London's myriad districts, gardens, and private estates. Crimson hinted at blood, of course, but also the color of rare flowers Atropa belladonna, deadly if handled carelessly, and perhaps a signature of the botanist. The phrasing implied a scene staged, perhaps theatrical, blending death and beauty in a spectacle only he could interpret. He moved quickly through the rain-slicked streets, tracing faint traces of exotic pollen, the botanist's calling card. The trail led him to a small, neglected courtyard near Covent Garden. Amid the shattered stone planters and weeds, one bush stood defiant, its flowers a deep, unnatural red, the petals curling in almost human shapes. Beneath it lay a body, a young woman, her face serene as though posed for a painting. Her hand clutched a single black petal, glistening like a dark mirror against her pale skin. Thorne's stomach tightened. The composition was deliberate. The botanist had arranged every detail with precision. Among the crimson blooms, a small folded note had been pinned with a silver needle. Observe. The choice is yours. Intervene too soon, and the lesson is lost. Hesitate, and you may bloom beside them. He knelt beside the body, examining the veins and the black petal. The pattern was subtly different from the previous ones, a more intricate spiral, a deeper engraving. Whoever designed these signatures was escalating, embedding meaning within meaning, using each death as a cipher. Thorne felt the familiar pull of obsession. Each murder was a puzzle, a test of intellect, courage, and moral fortitude. He realized with a sinking certainty that the botanist was not simply killing. They were instructing, manipulating, and perhaps judging him. Every crime scene was a reflection of his own choices, a challenge to his ethical boundaries. Detective Thorne returned to his lodgings in the early hours, the crimson blooms of the courtyard still haunting his vision. The black petal from the latest scene rested before him, glistening like a tiny shard of night. He spread his scattered notes, sketches, and letters across the table, seeking connections among the increasingly intricate puzzle. Each death now felt less random, more a chapter in a story written in petals, poison, and obsession. Hours passed in tense silence, interrupted only by the distant drip of rain from the roof. Thorne's mind traced patterns in the victims' lives, looking for threads invisible to others. The first corpse, found clutching a black petal in the Botanical Society's greenhouse, had been a botanist's apprentice. The severed hand in Crane's library had belonged to a rare plant collector who had recently refused a mysterious loan. The crimson bloom victim, Thorne realized, had been an informant, someone who had stumbled too close to secrets meant to remain buried. A disturbing picture emerged. The victims were all connected not through friendship or family, but through their proximity to rare and lethal plants, a network the botanist controlled, cultivated, and harvested like a gardener tending a deadly garden. Each death served as both warning and demonstration, showcasing the killer's mastery over biology, psychology, and design. Thorne's eyes settled on the newest clue, a ledger partially hidden beneath the carpet, its edges damp from the previous night's rain. The leather cover was embossed with a barely perceptible spiral dagger motif. He opened it, revealing pages filled with meticulous botanical records, notes on toxicity, and sketches of impossible hybrid plants. But what drew his attention most were the small annotations in the margins, dates, initials, and locations of death, both past and intended. His pulse quickened as he read the notes for the crimson bloom victim. In faint ink, a line stood out. "Observe carefully. The one who carries the black petal will understand the garden's lesson. Each step taken is a choice, each hesitation a bloom of consequence." It was not merely a record of murder. It was a manifesto, a philosophical treatise on death, beauty, and control. The botanist had elevated killing to an art form, designing each scene to reflect intention, morality, and intellect. And now the detective realized he himself had become part of the lesson. Thorne traced his finger across the ledger. A page listing future dates and locations suggested the next bloom was imminent. The handwriting, refined and deliberate, revealed both precision and theatricality. The botanist did not merely kill, they orchestrated events with a composer's care, each act part of a larger symphony. London streets lay in shrouded silence, the fog thick enough to swallow sound, enough to make the familiar alleys feel like a foreign, hostile wilderness. Detective Thorne moved through it with deliberate caution, the black petal secured in a vial at his breast pocket, the ledger's grim predictions pressing against the edges of his mind. The botanist's signature was no longer merely a clue. It was a command, an invisible hand guiding him toward the next scene of horror. The ledger's entries indicated the next bloom would occur at a private conservatory in the affluent district of Mayfair. Its owner, a wealthy horticulturist named Edmund Hargrove, was known for cultivating exotic plants in conditions that defied both botany and reason. Thorne had little doubt that the botanist had chosen the site deliberately, a place where beauty, opulence, and death could intertwine with theatrical precision. The entrance to the conservatory was guarded by wrought iron gates, twisted into floral spirals. Thorne pressed his hand against the cold metal, noting the subtle green powder dusted across the ironwork, a faint trace of pollen, unmistakably the botanist's signature. He slipped inside, the air immediately warm and humid, carrying the heavy fragrance of orchids and something darker, almost metallic. The path was lined with rare specimens, their leaves curling toward him, as though aware of his intrusion. At the center of the main hall, Thorne found the first indication of the botanist's choreography, a table draped in crimson velvet, upon which lay a single flower unlike any he had seen, a bloom of black and deep red, petals curling with subtle menace. A folded note rested beneath it. Observe the gardener's choice. Intervene wisely, or you will discover the cost of hesitation. Thorne's pulse quickened. The instruction was both warning and test. Somewhere in the conservatory, a human life hung in the balance. To act rashly could trigger the botanist's next lethal mechanism. To hesitate could allow the victim to perish. He began scanning the room, noting every shadow, every tendril of exotic flora, every reflective surface that could conceal both danger and clue. His eyes settled on a small alcove at the far end of the hall, where a faint shimmer of movement betrayed the presence of another person. Thorne approached cautiously, his mind racing to anticipate traps. There, bound in fine silk ropes, was Hargrove himself, unconscious but alive. Around him a complex lattice of vines stretched across the alcove, some tipped with spikes, others secreting a faint, acrid sap that could induce paralysis within seconds. London's fog pressed against the gas-lit streets like a living thing, clinging to Detective Thorne as he guided Edmund Hargrove back to safety. The crimson bloom of the conservatory still lingered in his mind, a symbol of both peril and obsession. But it was the name whispered by the rescued horticulturist Viridia that gnawed at him most. She was not a myth, nor a mere botanical curiosity. She was a presence, a force, intricately tied to the botanist's design. Back in the safety of his lodgings, Thorne spread his growing collection of notes across the table, connecting the threads of petals, victims, and cryptic messages. Each black petal, each spiral dagger motif, now pointed to something larger, a design deliberately constructed to manipulate and unsettle him. And now there was Viridia, name that echoed through the corridors of the botanist's labyrinth, like a ghostly signature. Hargrove, seated stiffly in the corner, spoke with trembling hesitation. Viridia, she was my mentor once. Brilliant, enigmatic. But she disappeared years ago, rumored to have abandoned the world of science entirely. I never imagined she would. Turn this way, to this. His voice broke as he described her last lectures, her obsession with poisons and exotic hybrids. She always said that plants could teach more than humans ever could, that they were capable of moral judgment. Thorne absorbed the words, recognizing a dangerous philosophy taking root. The botanist was not merely killing for power or pleasure. They or she viewed themselves as arbiter, judge, and instructor. using death as a tool to reveal human frailty and obsession. Every crime scene, every meticulously designed trap, was part of a moral experiment. A new note arrived beneath Thorne's door that evening, folded with ceremonial precision. Its message was stark. You see the blooms and yet do not understand the roots. Come to the East End. There the soil will speak. Thorne sensed immediacy. The botanist was accelerating, drawing him closer into her world. He studied the map of the East End's derelict warehouses and abandoned gardens, searching for a locus where rare and poisonous plants might flourish unnoticed. The decision gnawed at him to pursue alone, risking further traps or involve Hargrove, who had already glimpsed the botanist's deadly artistry. He chose to go alone. Part of him understood that hesitation was precisely what the botanist desired, chance to manipulate, to test, to fracture his resolve. The streets of the East End were soaked with rain, reflecting the dim lamplight like shallow pools of blood. He moved cautiously, each step measured, alert to the faintest disturbance of leaves, the subtle sheen of black petals scattered in the wet muck. At the center of an abandoned warehouse, he found the first deliberate display, a garden of shadowed plants, illuminated by faint, flickering gas lamps. Detective Thorne descended a narrow iron ladder, hidden beneath a trap door at the center of the warehouse, each rung slick with damp and rust. The faint glow from the black petal above barely penetrated the darkness, leaving him to navigate by instinct and the subtle sense of earth and decay. The air grew warmer, heavier, almost breathing with life or with something that mimicked life. At the bottom he entered a chamber that defied expectation, a subterranean garden, impossibly lush and wild, yet arranged with deliberate artistry. Vines twisted like snakes along the walls. Phosphorescent moss lit the space with an eerie green luminescence, and flowers of black, crimson, and violet pulsed faintly as if with a heartbeat. The smell of soil, rot, and poison mingled, intoxicating and disorienting, and Thorne felt the familiar tug of obsession, that perilous lure he had fought to resist. Every step he took seemed to echo in the cavernous space, yet the echoes returned altered, stretched, as if the room itself were alive, observing, judging. Ahead, a path of crushed black petals led deeper into the garden, toward a low stone altar entwined with thorned vines. Upon it rested a folded envelope, its edges soaked with dew and sap. Thorne approached cautiously, noting the subtle pulse of light along the vines, a rhythm almost imperceptible, yet precise. He recognized it as a form of communication, a botanical semaphore. One misstep could trigger hidden mechanisms, spores released into the air, thorns springing with lethal accuracy, or sap seeping into the skin with paralytic effect. The botanist had designed this space to test not only intellect but instinct, patience, and fear itself. The envelope contained a single page, the familiar looping script scrawled with exquisite precision. The soil remembers everything. Dig with care, detective, for the roots of knowledge are tangled with consequence. Some lessons demand more than observation. They demand a touch of courage, a drop of blood, or the surrender of the heart. Thorne's pulse quickened. He understood the implicit warning. The next stage of the botanist's design would not merely test his skill or intellect. It would test his morality, forcing him to confront his own limits and perhaps his own darkness. He knelt beside a patch of phosphorescent moss, brushing away layers of soil, to reveal a small coffin-like structure. Inside lay a miniature garden, each plant impossibly arranged, black petals intertwined with crimson, roots curling like fingers around tiny figurines of humans. The craftsmanship was grotesque yet exquisite, and among the plants a faint heartbeat pulsed, a living warning, a trap, a demonstration. The subterranean garden pulsed with an almost imperceptible life, the phosphorescent glow of black and crimson blooms, illuminating the twisted paths ahead. Detective Thorne's senses were taut, every nerve strung tight with anticipation and dread. He knew Viridia was observing, orchestrating each shadow, each scent, each subtle tremor in the air to test him. At the center of the chamber, a circle of thorned vines formed a maze-like enclosure. Inside, a series of raised pedestals held miniature gardens, each more grotesque and intricate than the last. On the central pedestal lay a single black petal, untouched and shining with unnatural luster. Thorne recognized the pattern. Each miniature garden was a puzzle, a moral and intellectual test, and each could be fatal if mishandled. Viridia's voice echoed softly from the shadows, melodic and precise. Each garden is a reflection, detective. Observe carefully, for the choices you make here will determine not only survival, but understanding. A single misstep and the soil itself will claim you. Thorne studied the first pedestal, a miniature forest of thorned vines, each branch tipped with a tiny glimmering droplet of sap. The accompanying note read, "Some knowledge is poisoned. Some truth is buried. Choose wisely which you pluck and which you leave in the soil." He realized immediately that the sap was a toxin. A drop could induce hallucinations so vivid that the mind might fracture, leaving the body alive but lost to its own perceptions. Yet to avoid the sap entirely would require discerning the subtle differences in the plants, growth patterns, a test of observation and intellect. Thorne approached carefully, brushing aside the smallest vines, noting the faint spirals and asymmetries that indicated safe passage. His pulse quickened as he reached the central flower, carefully lifting it from the soil. The sap glimmered, but did not touch him. One challenge completed, he moved to the next pedestal, a miniature marsh of black reeds, their edges jagged, coated in a subtle venom that could induce paralysis within moments. Each step demanded precision, focus, and courage. Mistakes would be punished not merely with pain but with psychological torment, a collapse of the mind orchestrated by the botanist's expertise in both botany and human perception. Thorne realized the full scope of Viridia's cruelty. She did not merely kill. She sculpted terror, designing trials that tested intellect, morality, and instinct in equal measure. The aftermath of the subterranean trial left Detective Thorne hollowed and trembling. He had survived, yes, but the survival was partial, and the cost had been paid not in blood alone, but in something more insidious, the creeping erosion of certainty, of moral grounding. The black petal he now carried seemed to pulse faintly in his palm, as though alive, as though aware of the toll the garden had exacted. Back in the fogged streets of London, every sound seemed amplified, the clatter of carriage wheels, the whisper of dripping water, the rustle of leaves pressed into the stone. Every shadow might conceal Viridia, or worse, the unseen tendrils of her influence. He felt that the city itself had become an extension of the garden, a sprawling, breathing labyrinth designed to test him in both intellect and endurance. Thorne returned to his lodgings, spreading his notes and the ledger before him. Hargrove's information, combined with the trials in the subterranean garden, painted a portrait of a figure whose obsession was absolute. Viridia, or the botanist, did not kill merely for revenge, or for gain, or for amusement. She was cultivating a narrative, a philosophy, an experiment that fused life, death, and knowledge into a single, unrelenting pursuit. He traced the timeline of murders, the locations of the black petals, and the composition of the poisonous plants used. Each element of the pattern revealed meticulous planning, suggesting that the botanist's ultimate goal was not simply a spree of killings, but the creation of an overarching, living testament to control, precision, and moral judgment. The garden was a microcosm. London itself might be the canvas. Yet beneath the methodical logic, a more personal, more dangerous truth gnawed at him. The botanist's choice of targets, the young apprentice, the collector, the informant, revealed a psychological aim to draw the detective closer, to sculpt him into both witness and participant, and to confront him with his own obsessions. The black petals, the spiral dagger motifs, the trials, they were all designed to force him into complicity, to fracture his moral certainty, to see whether he could remain detached, or whether he would, inevitably, become part of the garden. Thorne's reflection in the window startled him. He was gaunt, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion, and yet a strange intensity burned within them. He realized that the investigation had already claimed something of his former self. Each encounter with the botanist had been not only a test of intellect, but a probe into his own psyche, revealing vulnerabilities, desires, and compulsions that he had long ignored. The fog over London had thickened into an almost tangible presence, clinging to Detective Thorne as he hurried through narrow alleyways. Every shadow seemed alive, every glimmer of gaslight a potential trap. The ledger and black, petals pressed against his mind as heavily as the damp of the night. The botanist had already signaled the next bloom, and the name in the ledger, a young woman named Isolde Faraday, loomed over him like a countdown to catastrophe. Hargrove had insisted on accompanying him, his hands shaking, but Thorne knew this was a trial he must face alone. Each step toward the East End conservatories brought a gnawing awareness. The botanist's design was not only to end lives, but to shape the choices of those who pursued her. Intervention was fraught with peril. Hesitation could result in another death. He arrived at a derelict greenhouse, vines pressing against the windows like skeletal fingers. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and poison, a combination that made the mind sluggish, the heart anxious. Among the flora, crimson blooms shone like droplets of blood, their petals curling with a latent menace. And in the center of the floor, secured by intricate coils of vine, was Isolde, pale and trembling, her hands clutching a small bundle of rare seeds. Thorne froze. The plants were no ordinary trap, they were sensors, responsive to motion and heat, secreting venomous oils at the slightest provocation. One false move, and both he and Isolde could be incapacitated or worse. A note lay beside her, written in the botanist's unmistakable looping script. The observer is tested most severely. Intervene too hastily, and the fruit is poisoned. Hesitate, and the bloom withers. Choose, detective. Will you harvest or abstain? Thorn's mind raced. Each movement had consequences. To free Isolde recklessly might trigger the release of paralyzing toxins. To delay risked her life entirely. The botanist had designed this as a moral crucible. The choice was not merely about who lived or died, but about control, courage, and moral judgment. He studied the lattice of vines, noting subtle asymmetries, a faint pattern in the curvature of thorns. Observation, patience, and precision would allow him to manipulate the plants without triggering the toxins. Inch by inch, he used a length of rope to pull the outer vines aside, testing their reaction. The air thickened with the scent of black-petal pollen, clouding thought and perception, yet he pressed on. Each step was agony, every motion a negotiation with death itself. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he slowly freed Isolde's hands from the coils, mindful of the trembling thorns. At last she was liberated, though pale and shivering, eyes wide with terror. Thorn helped her to her feet, careful to avoid contact with the reactive flora. The fog had lifted slightly by dawn, revealing London's rooftops slick with rain, yet Detective Thorn's mind remained clouded with the memory of the greenhouse. The black petal he carried pulsed faintly, a reminder that each lesson from the botanist was not merely intellectual but almost corporeal, a weight pressing against thought and conscience. Isolde Faraday had been saved, but the knowledge of what could have gone wrong lingered like a poison in the blood. Back at his lodgings, Thorn spread the ledger and notes across the table once more. Amid the sketches of blooms, petals, and spiral dagger motifs, a pattern emerged that he had not noticed before, a subtle layering of botanical references, aligned with historical events in London's botanical circles. Each murder, each trial seemed intertwined with a larger narrative, almost like chapters in a story whose ending he could not yet read. Hargrove had been helpful, but Thorn now suspected the botanist's scope extended far beyond mere observation. She was reconstructing a personal history, entwining it with the deaths of those she deemed either complicit, careless, or insufficiently attuned to the moral lesson embedded in her garden. A forgotten detail in the ledger caught Thorn's eye, a faintly inscribed note in a margin, almost obscured by ink stains. The seed is never forgotten, even when buried. Roots remember what the sun cannot see. Thorn's pulse quickened. The phrase seemed less a riddle and more a confession, a hint at Viridia's past, perhaps even her motivations. He realized that her obsession with botanical mastery and moral instruction might have been born of personal tragedy, a formative wound that had grown into the grotesque architecture of her philosophy. He began digging through archival records of botanical societies, personal journals, and old newspaper clippings. Over the hours, a portrait of Viridia's early life emerged, a brilliant but isolated prodigy, obsessed with the study of rare and poisonous plants. Her mentor, a renowned but ethically rigid botanist, had perished under suspicious circumstances during an experimental study of hybrid toxicity. Rumors suggested Viridia had been blamed, or at least implicated, though no proof had ever surfaced. It was a seed of scandal, buried but not forgotten. Thorn realized that the botanist's meticulously designed garden of death was not only a philosophical experiment, but also an unfolding narrative of personal vengeance and moral reinterpretation. Her victims were not random. They were actors in a tableau that reflected her fractured history, her perception of justice, and her vision of perfection. As he pieced together the timeline, another chilling thought took root. Viridia's garden was not merely a reflection of her intellect, but a mirror of her psyche. Each petal, each poisoned bloom, each trial was an expression of grief, anger, and obsession. The streets of London were quiet beneath the evening fog, yet Detective Thorne felt a presence behind every corner, in every shadow a constant reminder that Viridia's gaze was never far. Each black petal he carried seemed heavier tonight, pulsing with an almost sentient insistence, as if the garden itself were aware of his thoughts and fears. The ledger's entries had grown increasingly precise, marking dates and locations with the meticulous hand of someone orchestrating not only deaths but the detective's path toward them. Thorne's latest reading suggested a new target, an esteemed botanist named Lawrence Kessler, whose research into hybrid toxins had brought him dangerously close to Viridia's unpublished findings. The botanist's design was clear. He would be the next trial, a node in the growing, intertwined network of observation and morality. Thorne arrived at Kessler's estate under cover of night, navigating the hedged pathways and glass houses heavy with dew. A faint phosphorescent glow emanated from the conservatory, the telltale signature of Viridia's manipulations. Inside, the air was thick with the perfume of exotic blooms, poisonous and beautiful, and the faint glimmer of black petals littered the floor, like ink spilled across a manuscript. At the center of the main conservatory stood Kessler, bound in delicate ivy that moved as though alive. Beside him, a series of pedestals held plants of unnatural beauty, each secreting microdoses of toxin designed to incapacitate anyone who touched them. A single black petal rested atop the largest pedestal, inscribed with the spiral dagger motif. A note lay at Kessler's side. The arbiter observes the roots before pruning the branches. One wrong step and the garden claims both witness and subject. Decide, detective. What constitutes justice? Thorne's mind raced. The scenario was familiar now, yet each repetition bore an escalation. The botanist was manipulating him, forcing choices that tested not only intellect and courage, but his very moral compass. To act rashly could mean disaster. To hesitate could ensure death. Viridia's philosophy demanded that he confront the moral consequences of every action, understanding the interconnectedness of life, death, and observation. Thorne's eyes swept the room, noting the subtle cues in the placement of leaves, the tension in the ivy, the faint glimmer of pollen that hinted at safe passages. Slowly, he began manipulating the vines with precise, calculated motions, avoiding the release of toxins while freeing Kessler inch by painstaking inch. The process was agonizingly slow, every moment pregnant with potential disaster. The fog had become a near-permanent shroud over London, pressing against windows and alleyways, muting the world to a muted grayscale. Detective Thorne walked alone, the black petal in his pocket a constant, unnerving pulse against his palm. Each step toward the East End felt like a descent, not merely through streets, but into the labyrinth of Viridia's mind. He now understood that every bloom, every death, every cryptic note was not random, it was deliberate, designed to lead him to a singular revelation. At the abandoned warehouse she had used before, the subterranean garden awaited. The black petals littered the floor like shadows cast by a moonless night. curling faintly as if breathing. The air was saturated with the scent of earth, poison, and decay, a combination that clawed at reason. Thorn traced a careful path, remembering every lesson from the trials, every subtle cue, every whisper of Viridia's philosophy. At the center, atop a pedestal of soil and twisted roots, lay a single final black petal, larger than any he had encountered, its edges glimmering faintly. Around it, small pots and containers held remnants of her previous victims' experiments, notes and rare hybrid seeds. And then he saw it, a collection of portraits, sketches, and letters to lives of those she had pruned and guided, their fates meticulously chronicled, forming a twisted arboretum of memory and obsession. A note rested against the final petal. The garden is not merely life or death, it is narrative, morality, and consequence entwined. Each bloom you have observed, each choice you have made, has been leading to this understanding. To grasp it fully, you must confront the root, the origin, and the fruit of intention. Thorn's gaze settled on a portrait, faintly smudged but unmistakable. A younger Viridia with her mentor, whose death had sparked the beginning of her obsession. The realization struck him like a dagger. The entire sequence, the murders, the petals, the trials, was an elaboration of personal vengeance and philosophical perfection. The victims were not only part of her narrative, they were elements of a moral calculus, tools to teach, punish, and refine understanding. A soft shuffle echoed behind him. Viridia emerged from the shadows, her presence commanding and terrifying. "Do you see now, detective?" she asked. "The garden is my memory, my philosophy, my judgment. You have walked through it, touched its petals, survived its trials. And yet, have you understood what it asks of you?" Thorn's mind raced. He had followed the breadcrumbs, rescued the threatened, and survived the subterranean trials. Yet the full measure of her design was heavier, more harrowing than he had imagined. To truly understand Viridia, he would have to confront not only her intentions, but the implications of his own actions. Every intervention, every hesitation, every moral compromise had already entwined him in the garden. Detective Thorn's hand hovered over the final black petal, the culmination of Viridia's design. The subterranean garden pulsed faintly around him, phosphorescent blooms, casting eerie shadows that seemed to twist and breathe with anticipation. The air was thick with scent, earth, poison, and the faint metallic tang of memory and mortality. Every nerve in his body was taut with the tension of the choice before him. Viridia stepped closer, her eyes dark and luminous in the dim light. "The fruit waits," she murmured. "It will reveal what you are capable of, or what you are willing to sacrifice to understand. Every step you have taken has led to this threshold. Every decision, every hesitation, has been observed, judged, and catalogued." Thorn's mind raced, replaying the sequence of deaths, rescues, and trials. He had seen lives hanging in the balance, navigated impossible botanical traps, and confronted moral dilemmas engineered with surgical precision. Each act had pulled him deeper into Viridia's philosophy, a philosophy that fused beauty, cruelty, intellect, and obsession into a single, unrelenting crucible. He glanced at Viridia. "And if I take it?" he asked. "What then?" She smiled faintly, a shadow of grief behind the predatory precision. "Then you understand, detective, not merely the mechanics of life and death, but the weight of choice. The garden does not forgive ignorance, nor does it reward fear. The fruit embodies clarity and consequence. Thorn's gaze returned to the petal. Its surface shimmered as if alive, black with crimson veins, tracing patterns like the spiral dagger, motifs he had seen at every crime scene. To grasp it was to accept the culmination of Viridia's moral and philosophical experiment. To leave it was to walk away from understanding, from insight, from the full reckoning of what he had witnessed, and perhaps from part of his own humanity. Time seemed to slow. The garden whispered in subtle shivers of leaf and root, a chorus of anticipation. He understood, finally, that the botanist had not merely been killing or instructing, she had been conducting a moral experiment in miniature, using London as her stage, and him as both participant and observer. And now the final act demanded a decision, one whose consequences would echo far beyond the walls of the warehouse, far beyond the petals, far beyond the victims. Thorn's fingers closed slowly around the petal. A shiver ran through the garden as if it had exhaled at the touch. Viridia's eyes glimmered with approval and sorrow simultaneously. "You see, detective," she whispered, "the root of understanding is never without cost. You have touched the fruit, and now the garden's judgment extends to you." Detective Thorn emerged from the subterranean. Garden as the first faint light of dawn broke over London, but the city seemed unchanged, fog-bound, quiet, indifferent. Yet within him everything had shifted. The black petal he carried now felt like a part of him, a pulse of judgment, memory, and consequence. He had touched the fruit, grasped the culmination of Viridia's intricate moral experiment, and survived. But survival did not mean release. Isolde Faraday waited at the street's edge, pale and shaken, clutching the bundle of rare seeds she had almost lost. Thorn handed her the black petal, its surface faintly shimmering in the morning light. "This is her lesson," he said quietly. "The botanist's garden is more than death. It is the measure of choices, the weight of observation, and the cost of action." Isolde's eyes widened as she took the petal. "But what now?" "Viridia, she is gone," Thorn interrupted softly, his voice heavy. "For now. She designed the trials to test me, to shape understanding, and then she disappears. That is the nature of her garden. The roots remain even if the trunk cannot be seen. And the fruit never truly leaves you." Thorn's mind drifted back over every step of the investigation. The apprentice, the collector, the informant, the trials in the subterranean gardens, the moral crucibles in which he had tested intellect against instinct, courage against hesitation. Each decision had been a brush stroke in a painting of life and death that Viridia had orchestrated, and now he bore the final impression, the subtle and enduring mark of her philosophy. He realized with chilling clarity that the garden was more than metaphor. It was a reflection of obsession itself, the human tendency to control, to judge, to manipulate. Viridia's art was not merely killing. It was a mirror held up to the world, and to those who dared walk within it. Thorn understood that some knowledge demanded a price, and that price was often not measured in life alone, but in the alteration of the soul. Isolde looked at him, trembling. "Will she come back?" Thorn's eyes traced the misty outlines of London's rooftops, the city unaware of the moral crucible it had just hosted. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps she has moved on, cultivating another garden elsewhere. The roots are patient, and we We have survived, but we are changed. The petals remain in our hands, in our choices, in our minds. He turned, moving through the fog, every step measured, aware of the echo of the trials in his bones. London's streets were empty but heavy with presence, as if the city itself had absorbed the lessons of the garden. The black petal pulsed faintly in his pocket, a reminder that understanding is never complete, that wisdom and terror are inseparable, and that some gardens are eternal, their roots entwined with the very observers they shape.